Okay, thanks, David. And so my name is John Geldhof. I'm an associate professor in human development and family studies here in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences. My talk today is going to be kind of a twist, but a great follow-up to David's talk, simply because I'm focusing on how do we stay positive, or the implications for strength-based approaches to youth development. What I'm going to talk about is focused on adolescents, youth aged, let's say, 10 to maybe 25. But realize that what we're talking about doesn't just apply to young people, it actually applies across the lifespan, and we're using young people as a specific case of these strength-based approaches. So I'm going to talk about what is a strength-based approach, then transition into models of positive youth development and talk specifically about the 5 C's model of positive youth development, which I've done most of my own research on, and then do a very high-level overview of some key findings and, more importantly, some implications that we can take home from what those findings are telling us, especially as it relates to positive youth development and strengths-based approaches throughout the world, not just here in the United States. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, there was this paradigm shift, if you will, in which people started to realize we can't keep focusing on weaknesses. And Week in 1989 specifically spoke to the social work community and said, you know what, most of our notions of what we might call helping hinge on weaknesses. We have a deficit-oriented approach. This is almost a medical model where we don't talk to young people unless they come to us with a complaint, or unless some sort of complaint manifests, and our immediate knee-jerk reaction is to treat the symptom, not the underlying cause. Well, this is especially true in adolescence, where historically we have this idea that adolescents look like this girl here. What's happening? I'm confused. I don't know what I should be doing. Tell me what to do. And we can think about our history and trace this all the way back to the early 20th century, even the 19th century, when G. Stanley Hall began speaking of Sturm und Drang. Merriam-Webster defines this as a late 18th century German literary movement characterized by works containing rousing actions and high emotionalism that often deal with an individual's revolt against society. Sturm und Drang meant adolescence. This is the period of storm and stress. And so for a long time, we thought that adolescents were dealing with storm, dealing with stress. Let's go back here, sorry. Hall even went as far as saying, every step of the upward way toward adulthood is strewn with wreckage of body, mind, and morals. There's not only arrest, but perversion at every stage, and hoodlumism, juvenile crime, and secret vice. Don't you wish you could write like that now? It's such an old-timey kind of great way of writing. But the idea here was that all of adolescence was predicated on a faulty understanding of evolution. It was based on recapitulation, where Hall and some early psychologists believed that the human psyche developed in a way that literally recapitulates all of the species that followed before us. And they saw adolescence as this moment in which we broke through. We were no longer we were no longer cavemen, but instead we had become civilized. And that process of becoming civilized must have been tumultuous. It must have been difficult. And therefore, adolescents are showing us how hard it was to go through that. We don't believe that anymore. We now realize that adolescents are more like these. Now, can you have emotional turmoil during adolescence? Of course. I have a 13-year-old. I'm starting to see this right now. And I'm sure I'm going to see it more and more and more for the next forever, probably. But what we do know is that contrary to a deficit-oriented approach, if we focus on strengths, if we think about the way that people thrive, it helps direct their development toward those strengths in a way that continues to build. So we want to focus on how do we understand youth strengths, how do we build those strengths, but then also understand that sometimes things need remediation. Week specifically mentioned that that strengths-based approaches had to only focus on the strengths. This is a very early approach, and now we're kind of realizing, no. You can't just simply say, what should kids be doing, what strengths should they they show, because if you do that, you fail to acknowledge that no, there are in fact limitations, there are obstacles, there is tumult. So this is the background from which the positive youth development perspective kind of arose in the, let's say, early to mid-90s. And early on, we started seeing slogans like this: problem-free is not fully prepared, or prevention is not promotion. And this got coupled with an idea in the research literature that adolescence, especially early adolescence, is a natural laboratory in which there's so much development going on. We can take young people at age 11, 12, or 13, have an intervention, and see massive effects by 13, 14, 15, maybe 20 years old. That's fairly quick when you think about how long it takes for an adult to develop. It's a more protracted time span. So the positive youth development really came out of this strength-based approach, this understanding that adolescence is an ontogenetic or a developmental laboratory for testing ideas that should apply across the lifespan. And this led Hamilton, and Pittman to describe 3 approaches to youth development. And I put youth development in italics here because it's not just how youth develop. At the time, youth development was a proxy for positive youth development. The pendulum had swung so far over that they weren't even thinking about the deficits. And so models of positive youth development broke down into principles, that is, universality or inclusiveness and a positive orientation to building strengths; specific practices, specific programs, the application of the principles mentioned above to planned set of practices or activities that foster the developmental process. We know that these already work. We've seen these for decades. This isn't new. We have Boy Scouts, we have 4-H, we have all of these youth-serving organizations who already knew this. And it took the researchers a while to catch up and realize, oh yeah, it's important to do that, isn't it? And then last, the Hamiltons described positive youth development as a natural process, or a theory, an approach to how young people develop. They describe the natural unfolding of potential inherent in the human organism. So there are several different models of positive youth development, several theories. Bill Damon, for instance, has an amazing set of work that is specifically dedicated to youth purpose and understanding that it's important for young people to have a purpose that exceeds beyond the self. And then Bill's work is really focused on what happens when somebody internalizes that purpose. Do they contribute back to the communities? Do they really make a difference? The model I want to focus on, though, is the 5 C's of positive youth development. A, because my postdoctoral advisor worked on this, and so I therefore also work on this. But B, because it's one that I think really does resonate across the lifespan and can apply beyond just youth. So the 5 C's model is predicated on a single understanding that person and context don't separate. We have people, we have the context they're embedded in, but it's really important to understand that every person is part of that context. And there's no clear distinction between where I end and where my context begins. So we can't really talk about things that are nature versus nurture. Genes don't develop in a vacuum, right? You have to have context for the genetics to actually take place. And so nature and nurture become fused, person and context become fused, and that allows us to describe thriving through what we call adaptive developmental regulations. And an adaptive developmental regulation, although it sounds kind of jargony, which it is, it's just saying that when people are developing, are they acting in ways in which they benefit and in ways in which their context is also benefiting. And if we do have young people benefiting their context, we do have young people developing in ways that benefit themselves, that's good, that's thriving. We don't want kids to be martyring themselves, giving themselves to the context so much that they forget to take care of themselves, which we do sometimes see that. And we don't want people to develop into narcissists or Machiavellians where they take and take and take and they benefit and benefit and benefit without giving back to the context. There has to be a balance. So that's all this adaptive developmental regulation is saying, that there is a balance, both person and context matter. And we can summarize indicators of thriving using these 5 C's. So competence means that a young person can go out into the context, competently navigate their surroundings, and achieve their goals. Confidence is then their reflection upon that. I can see that I can actually achieve my goals. I feel a sense of self-worth, of meaningfulness. We have to have some form of character, meaning an internalization of social norms, so that when we we interact with the world, we actually build the social setting back up with us. We have to care about other people. And most importantly, we have to be connected. I have to have social connections, social capital in order to leverage my strengths, but I also have to be connected in order to make sure that everything that I do benefits others in the community. And so the broad model of positive youth development really says that there's a commingling of personal and contextual assets, strengths in the community, strengths in the person, and that all kids, all contexts have strengths that we can capitalize on. Those come together and promote the 5 C's, if you will. And the 5 C's aren't thriving, they aren't the true model of positive youth development, but they're markers. They're saying, yep, things are progressing the way we hope they should be, and then that leads to better positive outcomes like contributions in the community, and should also reduce negative mental health outcomes like anxiety and depression. And it's not that this is a one-to-one. It's certainly possible to be contributing and also have anxiety, to be contributing and also feel depression. You can have high levels of competence, I know that I can do things, but still not feel complete inside. So it's much more complex than just this linear model might imply, but this is the gist of what we're trying to say. And this model's been tested really worldwide now, so I just want to highlight a few of the key folks who have pushed this model and where in the world they've been pushing it. So this is Rich and Jackie Lerner. They're the ones who came up with the 5 C's model. Their graduate student, Steinar Gestdottir, and I have done a ton of work in Iceland, of all places, looking at how in the Nordic countries and the Scandinavian countries and Northern Europe more generally, positive youth development can manifest. Rich and Jonathan Terrell and I have worked on a study funded by the Compassion International, which is looking in emerging contexts, developing countries, and seeing how specific interventions can lead to better indicators of thriving. Currently, they're looking in Rwanda and El Salvador. This is my friends Goda and Inga. They are in Lithuania. If we have any of our Baltic colleagues here, you'll understand this, I hope. I can't pronounce their last names, and I'm not going to try to do them a disservice by doing that. But Goda and Inga are amazing. They've been looking at this in these models in Eastern Europe, and especially finding that caring for others can be particularly problematic when you're in Eastern Europe. This is Ingrid Holsen and Tora Larsen. They're in Norway and have been doing a lot of work also in the Scandinavian countries on what does it mean to be thriving in those specific contexts. Ed Bowers and Daryl Hull and I have a paper coming out where we look at this in Costa Rica and Belize and have found similar things that the 5 C's do in fact matter. They do promote healthy functioning. They do reduce, or at least are correlated with lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression. Ed Bowers and I have also recently started a study in Kenya where we're looking at the same exact thing with our colleague Kennedy Onyeko. And then last, Nora William and Radosveta Dimitrova are doing a 33-country study of what does it mean for positive youth development in different contexts across the world. Because the way I conceptualize competence or confidence or caring is not necessarily the way that caring and confidence, et cetera, manifest in other contexts. We think there will be differences. So the 5 C's are certainly associated with mental health, positively associated with better outcomes, negatively associated with negative outcomes. I'm not going to go through all of the results here. I'm just going to say, here we have across 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years of adolescence, grades 6 through 12, correlations consistently showing that positive youth development, the 5 C's, predict contribution. They're negatively associated with depression, negatively associated with risk behaviors. And then there's this one weird little finding in which depressive symptoms end up being positively correlated with caring after you account for other elements of thriving. So I'll just come back to that in a minute. In Lithuania, my colleagues have found that the 5 C's are significantly associated with contributing to self, family, and community. In Iceland, we found especially that positive youth development, the 5 C's, are related to self-regulation skills, and that competence in particular is related to being able to set a goal and reach that goal. And this makes us think that, oh, maybe self-regulation is in fact a critical personal asset that can lead to future thriving. Here's another large set of numbers I'm not going to bore you with, except to say that in another study in Norway, Ingrid Holsen and I found exactly the same thing, except again, there was this one little pop out that didn't make much sense to us, and that was that anxiety and depressive symptoms were again positively associated with caring. And so this led to another set of studies that Ingrid and I did, where we started thinking about, well, wait a minute, all of our models of, of the 5 C's imply that more is better, but sometimes less is more. Sometimes when you care a lot about others, you can care too much. And so we did a series of analyses that showed when you already care, caring too much can actually be maladaptive. Being overly invested in your community, overly invested in your peers can lead to anxiety, depression, self-doubt. And so we've started replicating this and then extending this to issues related to Machiavellian personalities. Is it possible if you're overly confident, that also can cause negative outcomes? So the major implications here is, well, first off, life is complicated. If you're a practitioner or someone who works with youth or even a parent, realize that person and context both matter. You can't ask people to give and give and give and give because they'll end up burning themselves out. And similarly, you don't want young people to take and take and take and take because at that point they're becoming parasitic. So you have to find balance, but it's important to take time for yourself. It's important to make sure that you're having your own needs met as well. Because if you don't, you're not going to thrive. Programs, specifically youth-serving organizations, can then build on the big 3. They can focus on positive activities that sustain good adult-youth relationships. That's the connection piece that we talk about in the 5 C's. They can focus on activities that build life skills and then provide youth opportunities to participate and to lead, to really exercise these skills in ways that allow them to become stronger adolescents. So where are we headed then? The research is really going in an international direction, but also intranational. We've known for a while that different contexts, different cultures have different definitions of thriving or well-being, but what we haven't done a good job of recognizing yet is that even within the United States, we're a culturally diverse society. We may need to actually look at how does thriving manifest among different groups of Americans. We're extending these models into adulthood. Rob Stosky, I see him in the audience hiding back there, and I put a grant in at one point to actually look at these 5 C's in midlife and older adulthood. We're looking at more and more types of complexity and how we need to make sure that we ensure balance. You can care too much, but you can also have too much confidence. And then we haven't done a good job yet connecting the 5 C's specifically with mental health and specifically with individual unique diagnoses. So I think that's a very important place for us to be looking next. Thank you.